Dr. VasanthiJoseph, and today I'll be talking on the different types of evolutionary mechanisms. Natural selection is a very important concept in evolution, and natural selection actually tells you that the environment tries to favor those individuals or organisms which have favorable variations and helps them to adapt or live to a changing environment. The concept of natural selection was proposed by Charles Darwin, and it is a very important concept because if evolution has to proceed, then natural selection has a very integrative part to play in the process of evolution. The accumulation of this process, of the process of natural selection, where the environment tries to favor those individuals with the favorable variations, finally leads to the formation of a new species. So now you see new species appearing in a population. Instead of having a stagnant or a stable population, a few individuals try to accumulate mutations or changes in their genetic constitution, which makes them better adapted and allows them to grow into a species which is able to live in a new environment. Now we have three types of natural selection. We have the stabilizing or normalizing selection, the directional or progressive selection, and finally we have the disruptive or the divergent selection. Now we will see each one of these mechanisms of natural selection. The first one, the stabilizing or normalizing selection, generally operates in a very stable environment. So the population over here is constant or normal. They do not show any changes because the environment has not shown any changes. So even if there are mutations, one or two mutations or a few mutations in some of the individuals, it has been found that these deviant individuals which have these specialized characters are generally not accepted by the environment. They are slowly wiped out of the population. So natural selection tries to maintain the gene pool of a population, keeps it constant. So in such cases, evolution does not proceed at all because the population has the same type of gene pool within its genetic pool. So this was extensively studied by Bumpus in England, where he studied 136 sparrows against environmental factors like snow and storm. And in his study, he found that sparrows which had an average or normal weight and a normal length of the head, the body, as well as the beak, they were able to survive the rigors of the environment like the snow and the storm. But the deviant individuals, those that were above the normal weight or below the normal weight and length, they could not survive the rigors of this environment, and they were slowly wiped out of the population. So after such drastic environmental conditions, what survived were actually the sparrows that had the normal weight and length. So stabilizing selection arrests evolutionary changes. So evolution cannot proceed at all, and there is a standstill. Now we move to the second type, which is directional or progressive selection. Now this type of selection takes place in a population where the environment is changing. And so the population also keeps changing towards the direction of change. So what happens is, because the environment has changed, the individuals or organisms try to accumulate a few variations or deviations or changes, or what we call as mutations in their genetic constitutions. And it has been found that these changes or mutations are very favorable for the organism to live in a surviving or in a new environment. Okay. Now what happens is the normal individuals are gradually wiped out of the population because the environment has now changed. And the environment only tries to favor those individuals who have accumulated those adaptive changes or those genes or mutations which are more favorable for the organism to live in a changing environment. So now what happens is the gene pool gradually starts to change from the normal to that of a changed one to the new environment. So there is now a progress in evolution. A typical example of this is industrial melanism, which occurred in Great Britain. And this was clearly studied in Biston Betularia. This is a moth, okay? So before the industrial melanism or the industrial revolution in Great Britain, there were two types of Biston Betularia moths. Most of them were said to be light-colored moths, as you see in the picture, and a few of them were black-colored. Now, since there was no industrial revolution, the white-colored or the light-colored moths could easily camouflage with a light background, whereas the black-colored moths could be easily identified by the predator and they would be eaten up. Now, with the advancement of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, in the next 40 years, with the development of industries, what happened was a production of a lot of soot. So now the background was mostly black in color because of the soot. Now those few black moths which were left behind, they were never preyed upon because they could easily camouflage against the dark background and the birds could not spot them out. Whereas the birds could spot out the light-colored moths and started eating them up. And finally, in a span of 40 years, the white-colored moths were slowly wiped out. And what was left after the Industrial Revolution was only the black-colored moths. So this phenomenon which says that those which had deviant characters, those which accumulated mutations, could easily adapt themselves to changing environment. The third one is the disruptive or diversifying selection. Now here, the environment or natural selection tries to favor 2 or 3 phenotypes or characters in a given area. So if you look at the environment is heterogeneous because it has many microhabitats, and each microhabitat is influenced by its own microclimate. So we have individuals and organisms living in each one of these microhabitats, all right, subjected to different types of microclimates and environment. And some of them have been showing changes, have been accumulating mutations or changes. So if you look at each of the microhabitats, the selective pressure in each of these areas is different. Because we do not know which variations or which genetic changes are more favorable to organisms. So natural selection has different selective pressures in different microhabitats. So if you look at the area as a whole, okay, it produces genetic divergence. So each and every population in a microhabitat is genetically different from that of the other microhabitats. So there is genetic divergence, which finally leads to fragmentation of population. And this also brings about evolutionary changes. Like we have seen in the directional and progressive change, there are evolutionary changes even in disruptive selection. But in a given area, you see that natural selection has a different percentage of selection in the different microhabitats. A typical example of this is the mimetic butterflies, Papilio dardanus. So the males have tails and are generally avoided by the birds, whereas the females do not have this elongated tails, and so they are easily preyed upon by the birds. So if you look at this picture, there is a picture of the male Papilio dardanus, which has an extended tail at the bottom, and this extended tail generally is avoided by birds. But if you look at the female generally does not have a very long tail like this. So this is the male, and these are the females. Now female, what does it try to do? It tries to mimic other butterflies. For example, it tries to mimic, this is Chrysippus, and these two species are said to be the Naiavices type of butterflies. Now the female does not look like the male, but tries to mimic some other butterfly species like Chrysippus and Naiavices. And these butterflies are not eaten by the birds because they do not have a palatable taste. So the female, by adapting certain mutations and genes, right, and trying to resemble some other species, has tried to avoid being eaten up by birds or predators. So you see that some species are like this, like chrysops, and some species are like niovices. So selection pressure is different, for example, over here, and selection pressure could be different here, and selection pressure could be different in the other species. So the female of Papilio dardanus tries to resemble some other species which are unpalatable by birds and tries to avoid being preyed upon by predators. And so they are able to survive in the environment, they are able to multiply, produce a lot of young ones, and so their species have survived. And you see evolutionary changes. You definitely see evolutionary changes. So today we have seen the importance of natural selection in evolution. So it is a process by which the environment tries to select those species with favorable variations. As far as stabilizing selection is concerned, there is no evolution at all because it does not favor any mutations or changes in the genes. Whereas in the other two, the directional selection and in the disruptive selection, definitely evolution is proceeding because you see mutations accumulating and you see the environment accepting these mutations and allowing these individuals or organisms to survive in a new environment. So having gone through a series of evolutionary mechanisms, I think now you will have an idea on how life has really evolved on this planet Earth. Thank you.